So the other one is then the AVO2 difference. So the AVO2 difference represents the oxygen extraction of the tissue. And that is really fascinating to us. And again, it's starting to be looked at where people are using things like near-infrared spectroscopy during exercise, using things like moximeters and so on. But at the moment, the fidelity in the data isn't quite good enough. But it may yield some information, because what is fascinating is if we look at the workload where we start to see this change, it's around about 275 watts, which is actually at this point here. Now, that's above the lactate turn point, but it relates to, and would seem to relate to, what is called the respiratory compensation point, or crucially, what we call the critical power. So this may become quite a useful measure for us in the future. So how does this all get pieced together? How do we connect all of these things that we've learned? So here we've got our treadmill data that we saw earlier on. So we're going to add in what is called the lactate turn point, which we've identified, and this additional point here, which is called the lactate threshold. Now, we didn't deal with this particularly in the session, but the threshold refers to the first initial rise in blood lactate. It's not often cited, but I'm putting it in because I think it will enable us to establish a fourth zone, and you'll see why we haven't had to really focus on this within the session. If we then block these within colour, we start to see two really important responses. We add in the critical speed. Now, be careful, I've used this marker point here. It's not necessarily the next workload up for the individual, and you can't identify critical speed on an incremental test. On an incremental test, you would identify this using what's called the respiratory compensation point. If you want to identify it with critical speed, you'd have to recognise that it may not be, as I say, at a discrete workload that you'll see here. But I've done this to make our understanding work. And then we put the VO2 max on here. Given our understanding now with the underlying physiology, we can piece all this together. We've now got a zone where we know we get steady state conditions. So we know that VO2 reaches a steady state, blood lactate reaches a steady state in the moderate intensity domain, below the lactate turn point. And so this is steady base training. So this is where the athlete can go and do those long runs, those long cycle rides, those long rows. But it is different to what is happening in terms of recovery. And we have this easy zone. And the reason we have the easy zone is below this lactate threshold. So it's this point, below this point where lactate first starts to really appear. And so this becomes a zone where we do our recovery-based training between each workload. The tempo zone is our heavy domain. So in the heavy domain, we can attain a steady state, but it can't be held for prolonged periods of time. So you think about doing a tempo run, it may only be 40, 45 minutes, but you can get a steady state condition in terms of VO2, in terms of heart rate, and in terms of lactate. But go above the critical speed, or if you're going to do it on a treadmill test, the respiratory compensation point, and all that will happen is that the VO2, the lactate will all rise to the VO2 max. So this is where we have what's called the interval zone. Don't confuse this naturally with HIIT, but this is really where the HIIT-based training domain starts. Most people assume that HIIT is very high intensity. It's not. You can actually do quite long repetitions in this zone, which are designed to drive up the VO2 max. We haven't put in the underlying physiology, so now we know what we've been getting at. Moderate-based training, continuous exercise, developing the perhaps more morphological adaptations of the heart. It's less about oxygen extraction of the tissue. As you move further up the load scale here, the external load scale here, it's less about cardiovascular and more about microvascular based responses, the use of oxygen at the tissue, as reflected by that acceleration that we saw on the previous slide in the AVO2 difference, the difference in the arterial and venous oxygen concentrations. So now what we have, 4 distinct training zones for an endurance athlete, and 4 distinct zones where I get biological responses. These are the big 3, and I would use this one then if I was programming intervals or recovery sessions. So if I'm doing intervals in either of these zones, I wouldn't prescribe intervals in here at all, there's no benefit. But if I'm doing intervals in these zones, which allows me to do fundamentally more work, then the recovery would always take place in the easy zone down here. So we now go back to this work that we saw earlier on, and we kind of clear it up And now you can see the zones that Seeler was prescribing them to. What he referred to as zone 1 to zone 3. And we've got this zone 4 here. And just a different way of classifying fundamentally the moderate, heavy, and severe. What they've done is they've divided up that larger steady state zone into 2 zones. So they kind of got a long steady zone and a short steady zone. But now with the intensity zones attached to them, the training becomes more understandable. And here is zones. This is just to kind of give you an idea about training distribution in a group of elite athletes, and just seeing the way that they're spending that time in these 3 fundamental zones. Okay, so let's summarize where we got to. We've hopefully understood the difference now between intensity and load, and reflected on the difference really between an internal and external load. We've looked at really how we can monitor this, particularly using, in fact, treadmill-based exercise, but also monitoring the athletes in the field. There aren't a huge number of tools that you can use. You can't use heart rate really unless they're doing moderate intensity exercise. So do you use lactate? Well, you fall into the same problem. This is where external load monitoring becomes. But it's about using all of that information together. So don't rely on one metric. Don't just use heart rate. You probably want to use heart rate, lactate, and external load. Think about using something like an RPE. And together, you can start to judge what the athlete is doing in relation to the prescribed exercise intensity. And then finally, we've understood this in terms of the context of the physiology that dictates those exercise intensities and domains.